Hello and welcome to On Watch by MarketWatch. I'm Jeremy Owens. Today we want to do things a little differently and tell you a story about Uber, the rideshare service that has changed how we move around the world. The history of Uber has been told many times, to the point that a fictionalized TV drama was made detailing the company's rise. Uber became the poster child for an entire generation of startups that lost billions in venture capital in the hopes of disrupting large traditional industries and eventually replacing them. That approach has repeated across tech and beyond, as companies look to mimic Uber's rise. But for most of Uber's existence, it was bleeding money. It lost $9 billion in 2021 alone. By the end of 2022, though, Uber began to show profit, and it's been consistently profitable since. And Uber's stock price has more than tripled during that change. So how did Uber do it? That's the question we're going to explore today. Plus, we'll take a quick look at the news stories we're watching right now and how they'll affect your wallet. First, how Uber became profitable.
Without question, they introduced one of the best consumer value propositions ever.
That's Lynn Sherman, a professor at Columbia Business School and expert on transportation systems. He's written extensively about Uber.
You could put them on par with Google. Hey, wouldn't it be great if you could search the internet and find whatever you're looking for? Wouldn't it be great if you could push a button and have a driver magically take you exactly where you want to go? And they quickly emerged as one of the fastest growing companies ever.
But Uber wasn't the most profitable. Through the end of 2022, it had a cumulative loss of nearly $33 billion.
Then something magical happened in 2023 that has precipitated one of the greatest turnarounds in history.
That year, Uber reported a net profit of $1.9 billion.
Well, how the hell did they do that?
To answer that, we have to rewind to 2017, when Uber's co-founder, Travis Kalanick, was pushed out of the chief executive role.
Breaking news, Uber CEO Travis Kalanick resigning overnight amid recent scandals.
Kalanick is out entirely, at least as CEO of Uber, reportedly under pressure from some of the startup's largest shareholders.
At the time, Uber was burning through billions in venture capital funding. How? Well, they were rapidly expanding, and they were offering consumers prices that seemed too good to be true. 2017 saw a mass exodus of executives at the company. Kalanick left in June of 2017, saying that he accepted investors' requests so that, quote, Uber can go back to building rather than be distracted with another fight. He left the board later that year. He was replaced by Dara Khosrowshahi, then the CEO of Expedia Group. Khosrowshahi immediately changed the focus of Uber from rapid money-losing expansion to acting like, well, a real business.
One of his first meaningful actions was to start sharply raising Uber's consumer prices far faster than the CPI. So their prices went up over the ensuing 4 years about 3 times faster than the CPI. Now, I'm not saying this to be critical. I mean, if I were him, I would have done exactly the same thing. But as late as 2022, they still were losing $2 billion of net income and barely profitable on a free cash flow basis.
Khosrowshahi had done the things a real business was supposed to do. He laid off people at the beginning of the pandemic. He offloaded underperforming non-core businesses, Uber's moonshots. But by 2022, Uber's costs had gone up. And that tracked with critics' view of Uber that the company was not profitable on a unit basis, which means that each ride Uber performed lost money. So something had to change, and something did.
The real rocket boost came from a new driver pay policy. And that change has been the rocket fuel that has driven up their profitability and cash flow.
I should point out right now that Uber disputes Sherman's analysis. In a blog post responding to his contentions, they say that including tips and incentives, median driver earnings have grown over the past 6 years, from 2017 to 2023. I brought this up to Sherman. What they said in the blog post was that including tips and incentives, median driver earnings per utilized hour have grown nearly 30% over the last 6 years. They included a chart to show that.
Yeah. Well, it was kind of, when I first read their blog post, I was literally scratching my head saying, the only thing I was trying to raise in my article on the driver pay side was very, very specifically what was the driver pay impact from the time that Uber implemented this new driver pay policy. So the only thing I referred to in my article was what happened to driver pay between 2022 and when I did this work, third quarter of 2023. I didn't say anything about what happened to driver pay, earlier. So then when they say, hey, we've raised it since 2017, okay, well, that's interesting. But oddly enough, they included a chart that you just referred to that for the same period that I was reporting that their driver pay went down, so too did their own figures.
Right. You've used third-party data that collects receipts from both drivers and passengers en masse to try to figure out the decline in 2022 and 2023. Talk to us about that data and what they show you.
I was able to access data from 2 different data services companies that, among other things, collect usually receipt-based data. And between the two, Yipit Data was the one source I used on driver pricing. And then another company called Gridwise collects records from thousands and thousands of Uber drivers and the hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of trips that those drivers make. And I had the hard data on their driver pay. And I only was focusing on driver pay, including all forms, the base pay and any incentives or bonuses. I did exclude tips because, this was focusing on what is Uber paying their drivers and has that pay been going up or down?
Sherman's conclusions, which excluded tips, unlike Uber's data, showed Uber drivers' pay declining by about 15 to 17% from 2022 to 2023. If Uber increasing prices and cutting driver pay was the real impetus behind profitability, we need to know 2 more things: how they managed to do that, and what evidence of it there is. Let's start with that second point, the evidence. We're going to look at a very important metric called a take rate. To explain the take rate and what it means to drivers, I reached out to someone who's been behind the wheel of Ubers for many years, Sergio Avidian, who used to work on Wall Street and is now a gig worker and host of the Rideshare Guy podcast.
In layman's terms, take rate is the margin. Take rate is the difference in percentage terms between what the rider pays and what the driver receives, period.
That sounds pretty simple. The take rate is how much Uber takes from the fare you pay.
Let's say Uber has charged you as a rider $100, okay, for a trip. And the trip ended and the driver received $50 out of that 100, okay? So what is $50 of 100? 50%. That's the way I look at it. Now, Uber has a very different way of looking at take rate. So let's explain that. Uber says, no. We have to take our external expenses out of this. And then whatever's left over as the service fee is the actual take rate.
Using Avidian's example there, if Uber charges $100 and the driver gets paid $50, Uber wouldn't count that as a 50% take rate. Uber would subtract other operating expenses. In this example, let's say those expenses equal another 10% of the fare. Then Uber would say that the take rate was 40%. So even though Uber took 50% of the fare, they wouldn't count the part that went to expenses as part of the take rate.
So there is this argument right off the bat when it comes to take rates or margins. Which is it? Is it the Uber way that they're explaining things, or is it the simple driver way, the way they look at it?
So why does that matter? Well, to put it simply, by subtracting expenses, Uber would be able to publish much lower take rates than what a driver sees at the end of their ride. I spoke with the company about Sherman's contention that profitability largely stemmed from this rising take rate, and they heavily disputed that narrative. But Uber does report take rate every quarter, and it has increased since 2022. The take rates that Uber reports are based on generally accepted accounting principles, or GAAP, a term that will be familiar to those of us who follow corporate earnings carefully. When I spoke with Uber, they were adamant that the GAAP figure does not adequately reflect the true take rate, which the company says is lower because British drivers are treated as employees instead of contractors. This has been a point of dispute between drivers and Uber for some time. Here's Lynn Sherman.
The first time I was aware that there was going to be this kind of major redefinition on their part is I was listening to another podcast called On with Kara Swisher, and this podcast was recorded live in the Castro Theater in San Francisco, packed to the gills, and her guest in October of 2023 was none other than Dara Khosrowshahi. Kara Swisher asked him a question that said, we're hearing a lot of complaints from drivers that, Uber's taking a greater take rate and leaving the drivers on the short end of the stick. And then Dara launched into a response saying, well, that's just not the case.
So in the US, not including commercial insurance costs that are very expensive, our take rate is about 15%. But our 15% is the average of some drivers who have had good days and some drivers who have had bad days.
When you listen to the podcast, you'll hear someone shout out, "You're a liar."
Yeah.
I was homeless sleeping in my car when I was driving full-time for Uber.
Okay. I'm sorry about that. Okay. So I'm not lying, but I'm sorry it didn't work out for you.
It turns out that one of the tech workers in the audience had also been an Uber driver. And when she heard Uber's CEO say, hey, we're only taking 15%, and we think that's fair, she couldn't contain herself.
So this is a major sticking point for drivers. What is the true take rate? And there's another piece of this puzzle. How did Uber do this? We'll tell you more after the break. Stay with us. Welcome back to On Watch by MarketWatch. So, how exactly did Uber get to profitability? Well, Lynn Sherman and Sergio Avidian say that a new system Uber debuted in 2022 changed the way drivers were offered rides and brought in profits.
Something called upfront fares showed up.
Yeah, for about the first decade that Uber existed as a service, the driver just got told you're picking up a passenger. It didn't really have a destination.
No, we did. We just knew where to pick you up. And this is the other thing. Like I would tell my passenger, you do realize that I don't know where you're going, right? Until you get in the car and I slide it over and start your trip. But then they said, you know what? This is something drivers have been asking for a decade. We're just going to tell you all where the drop-off is. So then you can make a reasonably, educated decision on what you should make on this trip. And then we're also going to show you the fare.
Uber had given drivers what they were asking for in some markets, a system that showed them where exactly they were going and how much they would receive for the ride. While that additional information was welcomed by drivers, the new system ended up changing more than just what a driver sees. Here's Lynn Sherman again.
Drivers, instead of being paid a known minimum rate based on the actual time and distance, would now just be told, this is it. We're going to pay you $11 for this trip. Here's the address. It is 8 miles away and 30 minutes, and we're going to give you $11. Take it or leave it. So, you kind of decoupled the pay and the price from the actual time and distance, and it involves now a bunch of other factors. What are those factors? Who knows? It's just this mysterious black box algorithm.
In addition, Sherman said that Uber introduced an auction-based system where multiple drivers were given an offer for the same ride.
So all of this is to say is Uber went from a well-established minimum pay rate that was known for each trip to a new policy where they only have to pay the least amount that any driver will accept for any trip. And this has given them tremendous fare paying flexibility, and obviously it's turned out to be extremely harmful to drivers.
So that could be the missing piece. Sherman and Avidian say that Uber instituted new algorithms and systems that pay drivers as little as possible with no transparency into how the specific fares are determined while raising prices on consumers. After the company did so, its GAAP take rate increased and Uber began to report profit. Now, this is not how Uber sees it. The company said that the reason for the profitability is this. As trips on the platform keep reaching new all-time highs, our revenues are growing faster than our costs. Now, that's a direct quote from a 2023 blog post they posted after Lynn's assertions went public. But in the end, all of this appears to be just capitalism, and specifically the exact form of venture capital-backed startup capitalism that has become popular in recent decades, which Uber was already a symbol of. Tech companies have been offering seemingly unbelievable low prices on services while losing VC money. Once they've attracted the customers and the labor necessary to scale the service, they raise the price and look to cut costs. The same story could be told in the streaming industry, for instance. And AI offers the promise of more changes exactly like what Uber has accomplished, deploying high-powered algorithms to squeeze profit margins in their favor. Avidian appreciates what Uber has managed to do.
Dara has done quite a few good things, actually. But one thing they have also done well is pay the driver less. I am not against it. I'm a capitalist. I'm not against it whatsoever. However, when as a company, you deny something that the drivers are experiencing and the riders are experiencing. You built this massive, beautiful marketplace. Why are they so adamant against saying, yes, we are geniuses, we figured this out, we're charging as much as we can, pay as little as we can, and we're a profitable company?
And Lynn Sherman agreed.
They pride themselves with the strength and effectiveness of their public relations and lobbying efforts, but in this respect, I think their messaging, without question, has hurt their perceived trustworthiness. I think it's fair to say that they have a particularly toxic relationship with their driver community.
MarketWatch asked Uber to provide a statement or be interviewed on this subject. Instead, they pointed us to that blog post the company published late last year. You can find a link to that post in the show notes. Before we go, it's time for What We're Watching, a look at the news you need to know for the rest of the week and beyond. A port strike on the East Coast could have wide-ranging effects on prices and stocks. The International Longshoremen's Association began a strike on Tuesday that could shut down half the nation's ports as pre-holiday shipments arrive in the U.S. Shipments were being rerouted to the West Coast. Analysts suggested the strike could have an economic impact of roughly $4 billion per day, and said the most affected sectors include automobiles, as well as industries with time-sensitive shipments such as food and pharmaceutical supplies. On Friday, the latest jobs report will arrive, and the Federal Reserve will be watching closely, as we will be here at MarketWatch. Check out our live coverage and analysis of the report at MarketWatch.com, and we'll discuss the results next week. The Major League Baseball season ended last weekend, and so did the Oakland A's. The A's officially played their final game in Oakland last Thursday. Now, when the season began, we ran a segment about my struggles with buying tickets from the team directly when I knew my money would benefit the owner taking them elsewhere. I managed to avoid paying owner John Fisher for tickets until the final homestand, when I finally cracked. Last week, I attended the A's final 4 home games with my son and the best fans in baseball. There were a lot of emotions in the Coliseum. I managed to hold mine together right up until the final rendition of Take Me Out to the Ball Game, when I put my arm around my kid and the tears rolled. In the end, I got a moment I'll hold with me for the rest of my days. And like many other fans, I got some dirt from the field, which is now proudly displayed on my desk at MarketWatch. That's it for this week. Thanks to Lynn Sherman and Sergio Avidian for joining us. You can subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts, and please do. If you like what you heard, please leave us a rating or review. It really helps others discover the show. and let us know what you want to hear from us. You can reach us at onwatch@marketwatch.com. The show is hosted by me, Jeremy Owens, and produced by Alexis Moore. Isaac Gaines mixed this episode. Melissa Haggerty is the executive producer. We'll be back next week, and until then, we'll be watching.